In this bonus chapter, I'm going to show you how to do the puff sleeves. We also have got plenty of videos which I borrowed from the Western blouse, because in the Western blouse series we have got a load of options for the turn up here. So you could bias bind it, you could pipe it. There's loads of stuff you can do. You could also embroider this. So there are a few more videos for you to look at for that one. And the clue here is that you've got your overlocking and your seam towards the outside but hidden away, so that the inside is completely clean and it looks really great. Now in my case, I've just put a ribbon rose on there because it was the same color as that really beautiful lace that I had found, and the beads here are exactly that color. So I thought, yeah, that would be really cool. I put that in. So the sleeves themselves are also gathered here on the lower end. It's very important that you make that fit to the turn up. And then at the top again, it's really gathered. I like lots of volume to this. I like the slightly bigger sleeve. And again, make sure that it's 2 centimeters to the front and 2 to the back. And if it's an 8 to 10 or 10 to 12-year-old you're doing, then 2.5 centimeters towards the front and 2.5 towards the back. Don't let them run down too low. It really doesn't look nice. You want them only at the top, basically where that bone is. You don't want the gathers to come down, and you don't want any little pleats in here, which is very easy to do. So just watch out for that. For this sleeve, you need the cuffs and you need the actual sleeves, and you need a pair. For the cuff, I am just using a lining and the upper material with the right sides facing each other, and I sew those together at the upper edge. And then the sleeves I have actually interlined to make them a little bit firmer because it's silk, but that's not necessary, especially not if you're making this as a summer dress. You can work this entirely without interlining. And then on the sleeve we're going to insert gather threads to rows, and we're also inserting gather threads here at the lower end of the sleeve. And there you can see that I've interlined it. I'm just treating it as if it was one layer. Make sure that you've marked the front and the sleeve head before you start. I'm also going to use my stay tape. I could have also ironed interfacing onto the lining, but I prefer it like this. It depends really on the fabric that you're using. I wanted it to be a bit lighter because the whole dress is already quite lined and interlined. I could have used iron-on interfacing as well. Here I'm using the stay tape to ensure that nothing can stretch and that the edge lies really nicely. And just in case you've missed it, there are more videos how to sew these cuffs both with bound edges or piped, and that's also really nice. I would definitely have a look at that. When you do the next one, just push the next cuff under so that you do not waste any of your thread. And as you can see here, the stay tape I hold straight in front of my presser foot, whereas the cuff is moved into position. Now I'm going to cut back the upper edge here. You don't need to cut it back much actually, but a little bit is a good idea because we're going to understitch this now and push the seam to the lining, and it just is easier to do if you have cut it back so that we don't end up with a slightly crumply edge. So I'm folding over my seam allowance into the lining, and then I pop over to the sewing machine using stitch length 2.5. I'm going to put that in. Really pull the fabric apart, and because it is a curve, you have to go step by step here. You can't have it all lying flat in front of you, you know, that would end up with little pleats. You just have to do it step by step, and it'll curve up behind the presser foot as you move towards the end of your cuff. And while we're at the sewing machine, now we put in those gather threads. The first one is about 1/2 foot from the edge, and you have the longest stitch available, of course, so that you can pull the under threads of this. And then I put a second stitching line in, and that one sits foot width to the first one. And then when I sew my sleeve in, my 1 centimeter seam allowance will sit exactly between those two stitching lines. I do this on the lower end of the sleeve as well, where we have the markings directly from mark to mark. And again, we line up the second stitching line with the edge of the presser foot. And then I'm going to just iron these little cuffs nicely. And you will see that one edge here of the lining might be a little bit longer, and I just trim this off. It's just really minimal. It's a little bit here. You could also leave it. It's not, you know, pressing that you do it, but I tend to because it's a habit of mine. Now I'm going to close the cuffs, and I'm going to put a pin where the seam is so it can't move anywhere. I'm also going to close my sleeve. Just one pin will do. Next one. I've also serged the edges of the sleeve, as you can see here. And there we go, 1 centimeter seam allowance. You will go up and down a little bit. It's almost like a tiny slant while you do this, so don't just sew straight over. I see people do that. Stick to your seam allowance. Sew the sleeves as well, and again you put one piece in after the other to save your threads. You don't really need to leave threads hanging, that's just wasteful. There we go. Take off your pins, and then we can go and iron those seams apart, both for the cuff and for the sleeve. For the cuff, we're going to iron the seam apart first, and then I'm going to take my little embroidery scissor and I'm going to cut out the layers here. It's just flatter afterwards. You can also snip it, and then you fold it over and you give the edge a very good iron as well. Now I'm going to iron the sleeve seam apart. You could iron them together in one direction if you have very light fabric and you're not using any interlining. So now I need to pull the gather threads off the sleeve before I put the cuff on, right? So I'm going to secure it on one side so it can't go anywhere, and from the other side I pull as much as I can. The one thing that's slightly different here with my sleeve and cuff is that the cuff is actually an age 6 as opposed to the dress, which is a wide 3 to 4, because the measurement of the arm demanded that. So I won't have quite as many gathers here to make it fit to the cuff. But normally if you pull as much as you can, that is usually the right amount of gathers. Now we're going to put the cuff on. So you take your cuff and fold it, and then you can see the one that goes lower down, that is the front. Okay, so I know that is the two pieces that need to go together. Turn your sleeve so it's inside out, and also turn your cuff inside out, so we're literally having right side facing the wrong side, which is of course not what you normally do, right? So right side faces the seam, and our seam will actually face the outside like that. So now I'm going to put one pin in so that the seam sits on top of each other, and then I'll work my way towards my little snip where my gathers start. There we go. And I do that from the other side as well. I can already see I need to let out some of my gathers. Like I said, this is a 6-year-old cuff which sits on the 3 to 4-year-old sleeve. I'll have to let out some of that. There we go. Perfect. Now I'm just going to pull it a bit, just make sure that everything's okay. And I've got just the right amount. I don't want any tension there. So I need to take that pin back out, let out a little bit of my gathers until it's nice and flat, and then I put the gathers right in the center. So what I mean by that is that if you have the snips and you need to move your gathers, you can either spread them out, obviously, right to that snip, or you can move them equally into the center, which is what I was doing here. And then you can see that they should sit either side of the center. It's fine, really. It's not hard. You can just distribute them from snip to snip or have them more central. Either way, it'll look fantastic. Just make sure that you do the same on both your sleeves. And we're just going to do that again now, just for good measure. So you gather that lower part of your sleeve, turn the sleeve inside out, turn your cuff inside out, and pop the cuff on top. There we go. And then I'm just going to make sure that it's the right size. Let out a little bit of my gather. Again, I start from one side, moving towards the snip in my sleeve. There we are. And I do the same on the other side. And then I adjust my gathers, either having them go from snip to snip, which is fine, or moving them towards the center more, but just make sure that you have the same distance from gather to snip on either side so that it's even Steven, and that's it. Beautiful. Yep, looks good to me. Now what's important once you've finished all of this, that you ensure that both of your sleeves are exactly the same. Right, so what I would suggest is that you put those sleeves next to each other, starting at the underarm seam, and work your way around and see whether they are in the same position. And if they are, you're good. Now I'm going to sew those in. It's always more easy to sew from the inside of whatever it is that you're doing, right? I never try it the other way around because it will just be so hard, you know, and you'll go, oh, I never want to do this again. So if you do it like this, it's actually quite simple. You just keep moving that sleeve around as you get to it. And of course, the smaller the size, the harder that gets. The bigger the size, the easier it gets, right? And I'm just thinking, man, silk phrase, which is not so nice. But there you go. Once I get over that with the serger, which I'm going to do in a minute, then I'll be all okay. Secure your stitches. Fantastic. And now I'm just going to cut a little bit off. I know you're going to say, well, she's going to the serger, why isn't she doing it? It's number one, I want to make sure I have no pins in there. I want it to be like relatively clean because silk fibers really blunt any knife you use, any scissors. So it's a good idea, and it just gives you the feeling that you're working with a cleaner product. It's just a habit. I think that becoming very clean and tidy with your work is something we should all strive for, and you should see my kitchen in comparison to my sewing work. Sewing work, super tidy, kitchen, super messy, but it does give you a better result in the end, and not this feeling of you don't even know where you are anymore because there's so much thread everywhere. So pop on over to that serger now and just serge all the way around. I'm hardly cutting anything off now. It's really nice already. Make sure that it's nice and flat, that nothing pleats or folds and gets under your knife accidentally. That would not be good. Brilliant. Now we've got both done. We're going to fold the cuff to the outside now. And although you could go edge to edge here, I don't actually think that's very nice, and I never do it, but I have seen people do that thinking that's what they need to do. What I would suggest is that you go a little bit lower so that nothing can ever peep out. And the seam, of course, is hidden in between the cuff now and the sleeve. So look at that. See, I leave a little bit standing and even a little bit more here in this area. It just is so much nicer because of the seam allowance that really wants to push into that edge, and you should let it. And now I'm going to stitch in the ditch to secure it. All you do is put it under the sewing machine and just literally a few stitches right in the center of that seam. All secured, and we can put those to the side now until we have closed our side seams of the bodice and we can put our sleeves in. I think it looks absolutely gorgeous. Don't forget all the other videos for the sleeve that you can watch, which were originally for the Western blouse, and I guarantee you, you absolutely will fall in love with these sleeves. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.